We've seen a lot of very cool new technologies. The standards are in development. The technologies in many cases are already deployed. And one of the nice things is that the advances in these technologies are accompanied by advances in accessibility technologies as well. So we're going to learn more about that today from Becky Gibson, Senior Technical Staff at IBM. Please welcome Becky. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So, I have to go after all this exciting things. You've seen everything visualizing on the screen, and now I get to talk to you and people say, oh, accessibility, don't want to listen to her. No, 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 no. I'm going to here to tell you why it's important and how it's really not that hard. So a little bit about me. As Ian said, I work in IBM. I work in a really cool group called Emerging Technologies. So we are playing with a lot of these things, although not so much the graphic stuff, but a lot of our group is doing some stuff with Watson, the computer that played Jeopardy. And where I came from in this whole thing is I was charged with making the Dojo JavaScript toolkit, the widget set, accessible, because IBM wants to use that. So I've done a lot of work with accessibility with JavaScript toolkits. Now I'm currently working on the PhoneGap project, if you've heard of PhoneGap, which is an open source project that allows you to build your mobile applications using standard web technologies and then package it using the device SDKs and add in, provide a set of JavaScript APIs to device functionality. So you can build with the tools you know, with the standards you know, and then actually have a native app. Today we're going to talk about accessibility. I'm going to go through a real brief introduction. I apologize to those of you who have heard these things before, but unfortunately it seems that not everyone remembers accessibility and why it's important. We'll talk about how we enabled it. I'm going to talk about a new W3C candidate recommendation called ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. We have a demo of actually how we made a compelling, what I think is a compelling demo that works very well with a screen reader, and just a real brief section on futures. So what's accessibility? A lot of people think this, oh, my site's accessible. It's open 24 hours. Anybody can get to it whenever they want. And that's not it. So what we're doing is we're talking about accessibility is to let anybody with any ability access your website. So the thing that comes to mind immediately, especially after all the visual things we've seen, are people with vision issues. And we have here two examples, one of a little child with a white cane, familiar, and also somebody with a guide dog. There's mobility issues as well. We think about people in wheelchairs or with limited I don't want to say walking mobility. We don't think of them there. It's like, oh, they can see the screen, they can use their hands, not a big problem. But there's a lot of other mobility issues. Not everyone is capable of using a mouse and controlling a mouse, or even a keyboard. And they have to use what are called assistive switch devices, single switch devices, to actually interact with their computer. And you have to remember, at some point, it could also be you who has that two broken arms, and suddenly you have a temporary disability that makes it easier, more difficult for you to access the web. Other things, learning, not one a lot of us think about. Here the example was sort of a text with a dyslexic type of character reversal. There's many different learning abilities and capabilities and approaches to learning. There's hearing issues, which I suffer from some myself, which is a sort of a new phenomenon. It's not something people think. They don't realize that half the time you didn't hear what they said, and you get tired of saying, what? So you sort of work around it. There's age issues. Eventually all of us are going to age. We're going to run into our own mobility issues, our own cognitive issues, our own vision issues. You can't see as well as you get older. And then there's also color blindness. Think about those colors you're using. Just saying that something's green means it works. Not everyone can see that. And my guess is that probably there are several people in the audience who can't see the 56 that's within that circle of dots due to color blindness. And there's other issues as well. So basically what we're saying is, don't build sites like these. They're equivalent of these. The picture of a woman in a wheelchair approaching a set of stairs can't gain access to your site, your great, cool new features. So why do we care about accessibility? Well, first there's the government, the legal reasons. If you're from the United States, many of you are aware of the US Section 508 laws that require that if you're selling to the government must purchase the most accessible software. There's web content accessibility guidelines from the W3C, which I worked on that working group for several years. And we're trying to encourage different countries to adopt the WCAG, as it's referred to, or WCAG, depending on who you talk to, those different options for those rules for accessibility, so we could have potentially a worldwide standard. There's monetary reasons, buying power. The different estimates, the most common one I found is $1.7 billion of disposable income from people with disabilities. The other thing that we have to realize is the web really has made the world more accessible for a lot of people. Think about somebody that is blind or low vision, that can't drive, that doesn't have the ability to get to a store. They used to have to rely on someone else to either do their own grocery shopping, do their own shopping. Now, if you build a commerce website that's accessible, those people can now do their own shopping. They don't have to have somebody helping them all the time. It gives them more independence. And it's also the right things to do. And I don't want this to be taken wrong, because people with disabilities don't want your sympathy. They just want your respect. They understand that it's a little harder maybe for them to access and do things. They're willing to put in that extra effort as long as you take the effort on your side to give them the capability to try to do that. So I'm going to go do my Accessibility 101 talk. Now, I have to say, when I first started working in accessibility 9 or 10 years ago, I really got tired of every time I heard about accessibility, all anybody did was say, put alt text on images, put labels on form elements, and I got tired of hearing that. Unfortunately, you have to hear it again from me, because people still don't do that. And so it's like, I feel like I have to at least give the 5-minute overview. Here's the simple things you can do. Please do them. Don't ignore it. It's not hard. We'll talk about keyboard. We'll talk about high contrast mode. So we start off with semantic HTML. I think the first thing everybody does when they learn CSS, it's not necessarily this group, it's like, oh, cool. I can have this div, and I can make a style sheet, and I can now make it a heading. No, we don't want you to do that. Use semantic HTML. That's why there's H1, HX, whatever elements to do that for you. You can style those just as well. So in this case, that middle line is in green to show that that's probably the preferred method. If you're going to put a heading, put a heading. Screen readers have ways for the user to get from heading to heading on a page. If you style a div, they can't find it. We also would like the browsers to adopt that technology for screen reader users. For keyboard users. So if you use a keyboard, you could easily say, show me all the headers on this page, so you could navigate to them quickly. Another way is this, and I'm getting ahead of myself because this is part of what is ARIA, but another way is if you really don't want to use that H heading element for some reason, that you could add a role to give that div tag the semantics of a heading. Here's a classic one, alt text on images. I cannot tell you, just do a view source someday, and you will find that the majority of a lot of sites, I won't say the majority because the commercial sites are learning this, don't have alt text on their images. And you get it to, if I get to a page and I have just won the lottery, and there's an image that tells me I won, and my screen reader tells me file number 266726.jpg, I won't know that I've won the lottery. So I want to know that. So just throw in the alt text. And because so many things are server-based, you can do your internationalization on the server by knowing what language that browser expects, and do your substitution on the server so you can have internationalized alt text as well. Now again, if you just have the cute little image of a cat, it doesn't have any meaning, let the person that's using the screen reader know that by putting an empty alt text. And we'll talk about this again, because there's another way that you can identify images that are just for presentation. Label form elements. Okay, again, I know I apologize to you, those of you that do this already, but I know there's probably some in this audience that don't pay attention to this, and they're like, oh, it's just it's not. It's an extra element. Label for. Point to the form element that you're accessing. Now, I also get the back feedback. Well, the designer tells me they don't want any text on the page. That it's intuitively obvious that the little house icon there in front of the input tag means it's an address. Now, we can argue that point back and forth, but oftentimes the designer wins. So there are other ways that you can do this. You can put a label around that image of the house and add alt text. Not that hard. You can also use an ARIA. Again, I'm ahead of myself a little bit. You can also put that image in there, give it empty alt text, and you can add an ARIA label or a label right into the markup. Again, internationalized as well. So there's lots of options. Just because we say label your form element, if you really don't want a label element on your page for some reason, there's alternatives to that. And I talk about some more later. So all those things you can do, and you don't have to do any scripting. It's just plain HTML. It's in your markup. Now we need to add keyboard support. Because, of course, we're all doing everything we've seen here is all the latest cutting-edge technology. And a lot of it's being done with there's some scripting involved. So we need to make sure if we're building widgets or new custom elements, we need to make them focusable. And IE5 actually started this a long time ago where we can have the tab index attribute. And if you put a tab index attribute of 0 on nearly any element, you can put that in the tab order. So now somebody's tabbing through your page. So anchor and form elements are in the tab order by default. So when you enter a page and you hit tab, it's going to go from link to link to link, and it's going to hit those different form elements and buttons. And if you wanted to say have a div, and you have a fancy, and you create a new control, you want it in the tab order, you set tab index equals 0. And now it goes into the source code order, tab order. And you add your on click. Well, OK, that's not going to work. You've got to add an on key press, on key up, on key down. And again, a lot of the JavaScript toolkits that are out there today handle that for you, so you don't have to remember that you need a key press on one browser and a key up or key down on another browser. They normalize that for you. If you are doing other programmatic things, you can put tab index equals -1, and that allows you to programmatically focus an element. So if somebody hits a right arrow key, and that means expand a tree control item, you can programmatically set focus to that next item or go up or down. You can also put an item in a fixed tab order by putting a number greater than 0. I don't encourage you to do that because it can cause more problems, because items that have an actual positive number go first in the tab order before your default items, so your anchors and elements. And if you start to number some things, you end up numbering all of them. So just easier to use tab index at 0, -1, and now you got your scripting. But everybody's, scripting is pretty common. You can use progressive enhancement to add the functionality to build up your widgets. Now, this is another one that I don't see a lot of. How many people are familiar with Windows high contrast mode? There's some of you. OK, so what happens is this is a mode that people that have low vision use or have vision issues, where you can put your Windows machine into what's called high contrast mode. And you basically end up with two colors, a foreground and a background color. You also get a selection color. And you can pick those colors. And then what happens when you go into this mode, background images, CSS background images are turned off. And all CSS colors are turned off. So what happens, here's an example, is we have a rich text editor from one of the toolkits. It's not Dojo, because I worked on that one, made sure this was supported. And we see on the, that would be your left. You have a toolbar, and it has buttons, bold, italic, underline, things that you'd expect, paragraph styles. So now I put my machine into Windows high contrast mode. I selected black on white. And if you can see that picture, all those images are gone, because Windows high contrast mode turns off CSS background images. So, and that's a problem. How do I know what button to push suddenly? I mean, the other thing is also if you had used background colors for selection or focus, how do I know that focus is on that element, or if that's the selected element? I don't have those colors anymore. So there is a way to do that, and this is what we have done in the Dojo toolkit. You can programmatically, again, we're adding some scripting here, but I know everyone in this room is capable of that, is you can programmatically detect Windows high contrast mode. Basically, in your scripting, when you load your page, you create a div, programmatically create a div, and assign a different color to the left and right border. You have to add that into the DOM, into the document object model, and then examine the rendered color. So if I made the right border red and the and the left border blue, and I pull that div back in, look at it, and the two colors are the same. I don't care what color they are because I don't know what color the user may have picked. They could have picked pink and lime green for their two colors for their particular Windows operating system. If they're the same, I know that high contrast mode is on. So what we do in Dojo is now we use that cascade part of cascading style sheets, and we add a style onto our body element. So in Dojo, I picked one. Normally, I pick a style. In this case, the class was Claro that was added onto my body tag. When I detect Windows high contrast mode, I add yet another style. So now my body, my class becomes Claro digit underscore A11Y. A11Y for accessibility, A plus 11 letters Y. And now I can, in my style sheets, I have a whole set of styles that are marked with digit underscore A11Y that provide me text alternatives for those CSS images, and again, those additional styles to enhance focus, activation, or selection. So in other words, if something is selected and it gets a blue background color, I have a style that in high contrast mode, it will set a dotted border instead, so the user can see it. So this is the example from Dojo. We have in a dialog box here, and so in the first one, we see that there's just a little background image of an X to close the dialog box. And then in the high contrast, in this case, white on black mode, that's been replaced with just a standard text X. So how do we do that? This is the template for the Dojo dialog. It's nothing that any of you couldn't create in your own templates, your own widgets. We have a div that's given the class of digit dialog. It's got some other ARIA markup in there as well. And then further inside of that, we see there's a span with a class that's called close text, and it has just a standard little X, a text X right in there. If we look at the styles for those particular, if we look at the style sheet for that dialog, we see there's digit dialog.close text, and that has display none. So that's how I keep that X from showing when I'm in standard mode. But when I add, now I also have a style called digit underscore A11Y in front of that digit dialog, digit close text, and that says display in line. So when I've added digit underscore A11Y onto my body tag, and I cascade through this, that X is now going to be displayed. And so that's how I can do the text alternatives. So for that bold button that uses the background image or a sprite, I can say bold, the actual text that I want displayed in there. Right in the code. And we can use templating so that if we do have things internationalized, which the Dojo toolkit is, so any text that we use within the widgets themselves, they are internationalized. So this way, and sometimes you do have to add dash important the style to apply. And you see that we have to do different things on different browsers. In this case, IE had to have position absolute. For other things, it might be Mozilla. But one little piece of code at the start of the page to detect Windows high contrast mode, stick that style on there, and then as long as I created my styles and thought ahead when I was building up my widgets, I can support this Windows high contrast mode. So I've mentioned WAY ARIA. So that's my sort of overview. I gave you, the beginning stuff, semantic HTML, labels on form elements, alt text on images. We moved into scripting. So we're now adding keyboard support. We're adding support for Windows high contrast. Now I mentioned this WAY ARIA. That's from the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C. So there's the WAY ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. This actually came out of the group that I work with at IBM, and we did a lot of work proving the concept, taking it around, talking to people with disabilities, and then actually brought it to the W3C, and it's reached candidate recommendation. Basically, in a nutshell, it adds roles, states, and properties to your scripted elements to enable assistive technology support. That could be magnifiers, mostly it's screen readers that make use of this. There had to be changes to the browser to understand all of these new attributes and be able to use them. So here's an example of a tree control. This is a picture of a tree control showing the continents. It skipped my favorite of Antarctica, but we won't go there. And you can see that there's the outer div for this particular item would have a role of tree. So into the markup, we add role equals tree. Well, we look at Africa. That is given, the div or span that's used to create that is given a role equals tree item. This one happens to be expanded. We can see that there are 3 children displayed underneath Africa. So that has a property, aria expanded equals true. The next one down is Egypt. That's also given a role equals tree item. All of those items in the tree have that role. And in this case, that happens to be selected. I don't know how visible that is. It has a blue background. It should also have a dotted border. And it has aria selected equals true to indicate that this is the currently selected element within this widget. It doesn't have an aria expanded because it has no children. So aria expanded is like a 3-way. It's either there and it's true. That means, OK, I have children. They are visible. It's there and it's false, which means I do have children, but they're not visible. Or there's no property at all, which means I don't have children. And then just to finish the example, if we look at the Australian node, again, marked as a tree item, but it's aria expanded equals false. So again, nothing, sometimes it takes a little work to figure out what roles to use and how to change states. And now we're getting into scripted elements. So yes, a little bit more work here. But not all of it. That's for widgets. But again, here's a lot of the widget roles. And there's many, many more. These are just a brief list of some of the roles. We have value min, value max, value now. We have ways to say if something's required. We saw expanded. There's checked equals true or false. We have spinners, progress bars, elements that we don't have as part of standard HTML yet. So what I thought I'd do is we could look at some of the common aria roles that you can begin using today, even if you're not doing any scripting or minimal scripting. So say you're not building new widgets, but you can still make things accessible. Landmarks identify the main regions of the page. We saw some of the HTML5 elements that are coming out, nav, header. It escapes me. I don't know the list. But, and for people, and some of those are overlapping with some of these landmark roles, because again, we started this whole aria work before there was an HTML5. We were still dealing with XHTML back then. And some of these overlap, but you can add them both. It won't hurt. And then we have another role, presentation, which allows you to tell a screen reader that this isn't an important item in the accessibility hierarchy. And well, let's look at those closer. So here's an example of aria landmarks. This is a page that I built with Dojo to list the places that I'd give different presentations and talks. And so at the top of the page, we have that little banner that says Web A11Y, and it's marked with a role of banner. And so then it's split up. There's a main section of the page is split in 2, and on the left-hand side, we have a tree control that's used for navigation. And on the right-hand side, we have the main content. So when you click on an item in the tree control, it updates the right-hand side. And so that's the right-hand side is marked with main, the left-hand side with navigation. And at the bottom, we have what you would say is a footer. And again, here's a place where we don't match with those HTML5, because I believe HTML5, there's a footer element. This is a content info. It's like, here's more information about our content. So in this case, the aria role doesn't quite match the role from HTML5. This is really just a page showing you how simple it is if you have those divs and classes. I mean, to me, this is the easy part. The CSS, to get that to all line up where you want, that's like, I'm not a spatial person. So I use Dojo or another toolkit to get those things to line up. But all you have to do is find those sections and add the actual role to them. And if we go and look at this page, this is actually supported by the many screen readers. NVDA is an open source screen reader. JAWS is one of the, in the US, is probably the most popular screen reader. And then VoiceOver on the Mac. All of them support landmarks. And in this case, the user can actually pull up a dialog, and it will show you the list of the landmarks on the page. The user can go through that list, select one, and move immediately to that section. So if you're familiar with skip to main links, which we always encourage people to put in so that people with screen readers or keyboard users could easily get to the main content without having to tab through an entire multitude of links, say on a news site. This will do that. And we'd also, if there's browser, I know there's browser people out here because they're coming up later today, we'd really be great if the browsers would add this functionality. Why should just the screen reader users get this? This is perfect for keyboard users. so that they can just, in a browser, I can hit a key, it brings me up a list of the landmarks on the page, and I can get to them quickly. Or there's also ways to go from landmark to landmark in all the screen readers. So again, this didn't take any scripting, and I get that. Presentation role, this is, I talked about alt text on images. This is actually is listed in the specification as the preferred way to mark your images as decorative. Just put role equals presentation, and we're done. Nobody needs to care about it. It's also, if you're using tables for layout, oh no, people really do that? They do. Not everyone's a CSS spatial whiz, or they don't use a toolkit. So you can put, if you know that you're using a table and the only thing it's there for is to get everything to line up, then you can mark it as presentation. The other thing is a lot of the browsers see a div and they assume that a div has some meaning. And they'll put it in what's called the accessibility hierarchy. So they're trying to figure out what's this div being used for. And so if you know you're just using it for layout or you're using it for style, just mark it up and stick a role equals presentation. Again. Other states and properties that are useful. ARIA Live. Okay, we're going to get into a little scripting here because this is identifying items that are dynamically updated and how you should announce them. So at AJAX, everybody's familiar with that. It's the common thing. It's what took us from the web to Web 2.0. Other ones that are useful on form elements or elements that require input are required, invalid, read-only, disabled. Again, there's some overlap with some HTML5 attributes here. There's other ways I talked about using label on form elements. If you don't want them visual, if you can't put the tag near the content, there's a way to use ARIA describe by, label by, and label. So let's look at those. Live regions are good because AJAX is a problem. Somebody using a screen magnifier, not even a screen reader, a screen magnifier may be looking at the upper left-hand corner of the page. And you, in your site, are updating the lower right-hand corner of the page. Well, they're not going to know that. Again, maybe you told me I won the lottery. I want to know that. So this is a way of indicating that a region has been updated. And you have ways of saying how you want that region announced. You have ways of saying how much of that change do you want announced, and what type of changes to announce. So it gives you a lot of really fine control over that. And then you can even say if it's something the user expects that the website's going to be updating frequently, or it's an update that takes a lot of time, you can mark that region to say, hey, I'm working on it. It's not updated yet. So there's a lot of, here we can see an example. I don't know that that color was the best to use. This is part of the demo that we'll see in a few minutes from, it's an example of a mail application. So we have a toolbar at the top. We have some tab controls. We have the navigation as a tree control on the left-hand side. We have our list of mail on the upper right-hand side. And when the user clicks on one of those pieces of mail, they get updated using AJAX, XML, HTTP requests into the lower part of the screen. And if we mark that with a ARIA Live equals assertive, that tells the screen reader, OK, as soon as this change happens, tell the user about it. Don't wait. Even if I'm in the middle of reading another sentence, just start, give me that information. And we want that entire section read. So we would set atomic, ARIA atomic equals true. It means read the entire piece that just got updated. Now, if my top section of this page with all the mail file lists was, it's probably nowadays, those are live as well. As soon as a new mail comes in, it pops up in the list. I don't want to hear the entire list again. I just want to hear the new mail. So in that case, my ARIA atomic would be false, and it would only read the additions. And I could add the ARIA relevant to say that I wanted only additions spoken, not deletions, and text spoken. So let's look at other examples. We have ARIA required, and again, indicate that a field's required. Yeah, we still have to make some kind of visual indication. And again, here's another thing that I would say for the browsers. Why can't the browsers do this? If a required attribute is on something, why can't the browsers do something to distinguish that for me? And maybe even let me pick. Do I want an asterisk? Do I want an underline? Do I want it bold? Do I want it green? Give the user that choice. Not that hard. But for now, we need to add that. And So we do have required on an input field, but if you're building your own form control, like a number spinner, which we'll see shortly, you can add that ARIA-required to indicate, and the screen reader will speak that to the user to let them know that when they land focus on that field, that it's a required field. Another thing, again, takes a little bit of scripting or a round trip to your server, depending on how you're doing your validation. But you can also indicate when something is invalid, that the user entered an invalid entry. So in this case, we have a zip code field, and it's somebody has typed into it the letters O-N-E for 1. That's not valid. So in this case, there's a visual indication that with the color yellow in the background and a little icon, but there's also a non-visual indication that ARIA invalid is true has been added onto that element. Again, you're going to do validation anyway. It's not that much harder to add another attribute to provide this information to the user. Label is another one that we get. It's a way that you can add direct text directly onto the markup. So an example is that button. Now, most of us are all familiar, X means close. And we've been trained that through Windows. We've been trained that, now maybe if you've only ever seen a Mac, you're not sure that the X means. But this is a way to let people know, look, when you click this X, this button that just has an X on it, it's going to close. So you just put you can put ARIA label equals close right in the markup. Again, you're probably going to do things. Don't forget about internationalization. Whatever your website is should have taken that into account and be able to give that translated thing. And then ARIA label is good, and we sort of had to fight with that because originally we just had labeled by, and that assumed that takes an ID or multiple IDs to the element that has the label information. I'm trying to be careful here. I don't know if you've caught me. I probably said tag instead of element, but I'm trying to be clear that it really is an element that we're talking about. So anyway, you can use ARIA label by so that you can point to something, and you can even point to off-screen things. So we'll look at some of these examples. This example is from the University of Illinois. It's a little bit overkill because what they've done here is they've created a spin button. And so it says choose a number between 0 and 100. And they're creating this. And this is just a brief example of the markup. There's scripting that goes beyond this to progressively enhance this with all the behaviors. But we start and we see that they have a label in there, a label element with the for attribute, and they've given that label element an ID. Now, because they're building this widget out of divs and spans, I checked the HTML5 spec this morning, and a div is not a valid element to associate a label with. So we have to give it that label somewhere else. So one could argue this isn't completely correct code, but that's sort of overkill. The key there is that div, we see that div that says class spin button. Again, role equals spin button. So again, we're using an ARIA role to identify this as a widget. It has an ARIA label by that SB1_label, which is the ID above that has the text that we want associated with this control as a label. There's other, a bunch of other ARIA properties in here as well. There's the value min, value max, and value now attributes that allow you to say what the range is of the spin button. There's also ARIA required. Here's an example where we don't have that as an attribute part of the element, so we have to add the ARIA required. And then down below, the buttons in this particular example aren't meant to be in the tab order. They're not meant to be used by the keyboard user. They don't put focus on the up button and hit enter, enter, enter to go up, or put focus on the down button. They actually put focus on the control and use the keyboard, up and down arrow keys, which is scripted into this. So for those images, there's no need for the screen reader user to know about them, because they're never going to set focus there. So we mark those as presentation. Another example is describe by. So if you've ever gone to a news site and they give you those little blurbs, and then it says more info, more info. Now, if you're a screen reader user and you come in and you're like, good, show me all the links on this page. And the screen reader will usually give you a little dialogue, and it'll show you all the links. And they all say more info, more info, more info. You're like, more info about what? What am I learning about? So this is a way to use describe by. So all I've done is we have a little thing about Alaska. Storm cracks an iceberg. This was from a couple years ago. and then more info. So all I've done is inside of that, I put a span around the first sentence in that particular blurb. I gave it an ID. Then in the anchor element, I actually did area described by, and I point to that ID. So if the screen reader user tabs to that and it says more info, they'll know it's more info, Alaska storm cracks iceberg in Antarctica. Again, these are not hard things to do, and they make life so much better for people that are using and accessing your site for the different techniques. Another one is you can also set that off screen. So here's a little thing. OK, here's a new invitation. Please accept or reject the invitation from Melodrama. And all the buttons say is accept, reject. Now, you could have 7 of these on your screen. And if you're tabbing through the buttons, you're going to hear accept, reject, and you're like, who the heck am I accepting as a friend? So we have an off screen, and we position with a position of absolute and a margin top. I tend to use top rather than left or right, because we want to deal with both types of directions on our languages. So, and then I just put right in there, I put the text that I want, accept invitation to connect from Melodrama. And that, because that's off screen, the cited user doesn't see that, because it's fairly obvious to them based on the presentation who they're accepting or rejecting. But the screen reader user, when focus goes to that accept button, will give them the entire piece of information. So again, these are not anything all that hard to do. So what I've done is, and fumble up here with screen reader demos and such, I actually recorded a demo. So if we could play that demo now.
Cam Studio.
This is a demonstration of the Dojo sample mail application from a daily Dojo build in September 2011. I'm running with the JAWS version 12 screen reader in Firefox 6.0.2.
Alt-Tab, Demo Mail Application, Shift-Tab, Toolbar, Get Mail button to activate, press spacebar.
You could hear that we were in a toolbar. We were on a button in the toolbar. We could activate it by pressing the spacebar or the Enter key.
Enter, read only.
We could...
Toolbar, Enter, menu, Yahoo. To move through items, press up or down arrow.
For the arrow, we can arrow
Gmail.
down. We can, again, press Enter to accept that, or Escape to close it.
Menus, Toolbar, Mail Source Options button, menu. Press space to activate the menu, then navigate with arrow keys.
I'm going to tab to the next component.
Tab, Dialog, Inbox tab, 1 of 2.
I can arrow to the
Contacts
right
tab,
to
2
see
of
the
2.
other tab. If I arrow back left,
Inbox tab, 1 of 2.
tab to the next component on the
Tab,
page.
Folders tab open, 1 of 2. Search messages tab open, 2 of 2.
If I arrow key.
Subject, center, message text, colon.
This was also a accordion pane, and I can arrow through to pick the one that I want to interact with. I'm going to arrow key back up.
Folders tab open, 1 of 2.
I'm going to tab into
Tab
that.
to move through or tab, folders open.
It's told me folders open. That gives me an idea that it's something that can be open or closed. I'm going to arrow down.
1, inbox, 1 of 3. To move through or expand items, use the arrow keys.
It tells me how many items there are. I'm going to quickly go down to save.
Save, open. To move through or expand items, use the arrow keys.
I can hit the left arrow key to collapse.
Save, closed, 3 of 3.
And I'm told that information. I can go to tab to the next component.
Tab, separator.
In this case, if I was a visual user, I could change the size of this border container using the arrow keys.
Tab, colon, row 1. Center column header, read only.
I'm in a table. I heard call 1 row 1, and it was read only. And I was told it was a column header, so I can arrow through the headers.
Subject, column header, read only.
I can tab into the content of the table.
Center, colon, row 2. Adam Marlin.
Notice it tells me the column header. If I down arrow,
Bob Baxter.
it doesn't repeat the column header, but if I change columns, I'll see that.
Subject, remaining work.
If I select one of these,
Enter. Selected. From colon Bob Baxter, subject, colon, remaining work.
okay, so that's good. If we can cut that
18.
off, that'll be good. I won't make you suffer through that, but that's how a person with a screen reader actually interacts. And you can see that you were able to understand what those components are. You were in a toolbar. You were in, it didn't say tree control, I think it did, and it told you were in a tab. a tab container, so you could tab back and forth. You were in a column, you could hear the column headers. You saw that ARIA live. When they clicked on that mail and that mail loaded, it was read to the screen reader user. Now, if you have ever, how many have ever interacted with somebody actually using a screen reader? So you know that they don't listen anywhere near that speed. You and I would not be able to follow along at the speed that they can distinguish that from. And they don't hear all of those extra little, press up or down arrow, blah, 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 blah. They understand, they know that already, the screen reader. So it's fascinating. So just a few things to finish up here. Talking about futures, mobile. Obviously, mobile is hot. I'm working on mobile now. And just as sort of an example, VoiceOver, screen reader, and ARIA support is in Safari and mobile Safari, and it sort of really gives iOS the mobile accessibility advantage. Now, that's not to say the other platforms aren't accessible. Android has a lot of speech features, but they're not necessarily universal across the apps. They don't have an accessibility API. Techies that have visual impairments do use Android. I've seen them. They're usable. But the iOS is currently the most accessible. There are third-party solutions for BlackBerry. Windows 7 does have some low vision and speech features, and I keep hearing all these rumors about what's coming in Windows 8 to make that more accessible. So there are, the things that you're doing now that you do on your desktop, if you add ARIA, that's going to help you on mobile too, especially if you're building mobile web. The other thing, and I've already been told that I have the wrong title for this, is intentional events, which may become indie events, independent events. Basically, if you take a tree control, there's no, how do I expand and collapse on, if I put a tree control on my phone? There's no right now we key off of the right mouse menu. So you hit the right arrow key, the right arrow key, and we say, oh, that means expand. And you hit the left arrow key, and that gets interpreted. We really need that to be more intentional. We need an event that says, OK, the user did the gesture that said expand. And the user did so raise that event and respond to the expand or close event, rather than relying on keyboard-specific things. So there is a working group being chartered within WAY, Web Accessibility Initiative, to work on that. So with that, I've rattled on long enough. I hope I showed you that accessibility is important. And I did give you some of you, it was a repeat, it was an overview, but it really is not that hard to make your apps accessible. You just have to follow these standards, and if you're using Semantic HTML, it's hard for me to follow all that cool stuff that came up here and think, oh, I got to make that accessible. But because it's based on semantic elements, we have we can go ahead and continue working on figuring out how can we make SVG accessible? How can we tell you? We can tell you what the role is of that item. There's a whole group within IBM that's working on complex visualizations, and how do we make that accessible? ARIA is here. It's a candidate recommendation. Go ahead and use it. It's not hard, and you can make accessibility mainstream. So I did include a few links. I don't know. We only have a couple minutes. I don't know if we have time for questions. But there's a lot of information on the W3C site. Dojo itself, its toolkit is, its core widgets are fully accessible. jQuery UI is working on accessibility, adding ARIA. The Google widget toolkit, GWT, is also adding them. Some of the other ones are. But think about that when you pick a toolkit as well. Are they going to help me with accessibility, or am I going to have to do it myself? So with that, I will thank you for letting me preach my message. And questions or not?
Doug Shepard's W3C. I may have missed it, but did you say what browsers support ARIA?
Yes, no, you're right. I didn't say that. So all the modern browsers support ARIA. Actually, Firefox was the leader here, and it started in 2.0. But now any of the Firefox 3.6 and beyond, the IE 8 and beyond, so you don't get it in 6 and 7. But you can still do high contrast in keyboard, so you don't get off the hook there. And Opera, I should know that, I know 9, but it might be sooner than that. Safari, 5.1 is the best. The later is better. Obviously, IE 8 and above are there. And Chrome is still lacking a bit. And then if you use JAWS, you really want to be using, if you're using the JAWS screen reader, you want to be using you're better off the later, the better. 10 was really pretty good. 11, 12, they keep improving. The NVDA open source screen reader, and then now VoiceOver with Lion gives you the best support. OK, great. I think we wrapped it up. So again, thanks for your attention.